Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Hi there. Welcome to A Talk on the Wild Side, your bi-weekly tour of all things wild in Texas. We have a special treat for you today. We're doing a joint episode with Deer U, where we're going to talk to my colleague, Mike Cherry. But I want to throw it over to Bronson Strickland at Deer U to do a little introduction himself.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and I look forward to this. Hopefully, again, it's going to be a good opportunity for both of us. So the Deer University listeners can get exposed to your podcast and a Talk on the Wild Side, the same for Deer University. So thank you for the opportunity. And Mike, I've been looking forward to having a conversation with you. You're one of those deer nuts, and always fun to talk to a deer nut. But I think what is really interesting with you is that you have a unique perspective, and you're, of course, now in Texas. And if I remember correctly, you're from Texas originally, but you did a lot of work in the Southeast, in Georgia and Florida, and then in Virginia. Mm-hmm. So you've really seen a lot of different management situations, and limiting factors for deer herds. So I think this is going to be interesting as we kind of compare and contrast. And Mike, I don't want to oversimplify your title. I'm probably going to butcher it here, but you're the Stuart Stedman Chair for Deer Research. Did I get that right?
That is correct.
All right. And well, how are things going in South Texas?
Things are good. We finally got a little rain, and so things are looking better. The deer season is upon us, so we have a lot of excited people down here in South Texas, and things are good.
Excellent. We, I know people in Texas would laugh at what I'm about to say, but we're going through a little drought over here. Mm-hmm. It's a Southeastern context drought, not a South Texas drought. But yeah, October has been really, really dry for us. And so, Mike, you know what everybody's doing over here. We're concerned about food plots and things like that, and getting ready for deer season. So that's one of our big management issues right now, is overcoming lack of rainfall. But I'm sure when November rolls around, the rains will return and all will be well. So Mike, I guess the theme of this, I would love to have a conversation with you, is under the umbrella of comparing and contrasting deer management in South Texas versus deer management in the Southeast. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, you have a really qualified and unique perspective because you've worked in both environments. So I thought I would start with something that it may not make a lot of sense to people unless you've been in that environment. And that is what my former mentor, and still a mentor of mine, Charlie DeYoung, is in that environment. He says that the deer herds really aren't density dependent. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could maybe explain that a little bit better for our listeners. What does Charlie mean by that?
Sure. Yeah. So density dependence is something we think about in any kind of population ecology, where we see the number of individuals within a population. As that increases, the per capita resource availability decreases. And then there's mechanisms such as reproductive output or survival that feed back into the population and cause some slowing of the population growth rate. That's the typical density dependent response that we think about across populations. In South Texas, we don't think they're necessarily operating that way, or we think that density dependence is weak. And the reason we think that is because there are factors that drive those reproductive processes that are totally independent of the deer density. And so we have these situations where it doesn't really matter how many deer are on the landscape. If it doesn't rain, the fawn crop is all but lost. If there are a lot of deer on the landscape in a good year, then there's still plenty of forage for all of them. And the variation in that per capita resource availability is moving around in a margin that really doesn't matter for population growth rates. And so we have populations down here that boom and bust with rainfall patterns. And really, it's not the only place that operates like that. I've worked in a lot of different systems, as you mentioned, and in Texas is an extreme example of this, but I often have described the places I've worked as a dynamic system. And so, I really, moving down here, as you were mentioning the drought in the Southeast, it kind of made me think about my changing perspective about what a dynamic system is. As you get down here, you realize there's a real boom and bust that happens. And this last year, this summer was really bad. We had very little rainfall until very late in the summer. But there are places in the Southeast that operate where density dependence is weak or absent. And so other examples where weather can be a major driver that is independent of how many deer are on the landscape, but weather can drive that resource availability so much that the number of deer responding to it is pretty inconsequential. And so we've seen that in South Florida where rainfall again, but it's the opposite. And in years that are too wet, they have a failure in their fawn crop. Another system where we've seen that is in North Florida, where there's just an abundance of bad forage. And it really doesn't matter if you have twice as many deer, or half as many deer, they're all still eating really poor forage, and there's plenty of it. And so the density really doesn't affect that population growth rate. And in the third place in the Southeast, or at least the Mid-Atlantic, where we've seen a similar response is in the Appalachian Mountains. And so I used to work up there quite a bit, and really it's all dependent upon acorn mast crops. And so when you have really good acorn crops, all the fawns survive and things are really good. And if you don't, then there's very low fawn survival rates. And so it's really a phenomenon whereby weather or some factor such as acorns, some important resource, is weakly linked to their density. And so, of course, mathematically, there's always a division by the number of individuals in a population and those resources. So you can always calculate a change in a per capita resource availability. But if that change is inconsequential, that's where you see this density independence that we have down here in South Texas.
So maybe a very simplified way to express this would be in your typical Southeastern scenario, there are very reliable responses to too many animals. In other words, too many animals equals not enough food relative to the number of animals available. But in some of these other systems, you're seeing environmental phenomenon that may supersede the number of animals. They're essentially more important than the number of animals on the landscape. And those are working in concert, of course.
Absolutely. Very well put, Bronson. Yeah, that's really what it is. If there's some external force, whether it's weather or one individual resource that supersedes that deer density and driving that per capita resource availability that ultimately drives reproduction and survival.
Gotcha. So the big management question then, Mike, and that's probably going to drive the rest of your career, is what do you do? What do you do about that? And as my buddy and y'all's buddy, Donnie Drager, always says, is, man, on those years that you have rainfall, you look like a heck of a good deer manager. And on the drought years, not so much. But so maybe we could talk about, was supplemental feeding is the genesis of that, I would say, is in South Texas. That's really where it took hold and gained popularity. Was mainly that an attempt to smooth out the lack of food resources available? You could add a constant to the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really what drives it, is trying to raise the floor for those really bad years. And so you don't have that catastrophic lost cohort that you can have in a drought year. So you can't replace the rain, but you can absolutely make it less important by maintaining a more consistent resource like supplemental feed. So I think really to lift that floor, but also to raise the ceiling of what you can achieve in really good years is the other big motivator that people have for supplemental feeding. And it has been shown by Charlie DeYoung and others to greatly benefit a lot of the population metrics and morphometric metrics that we use to identify population health. And so those probably are the two main drivers for motivating people to use supplemental feed.
Gotcha. So what role does habitat play? And what are proactive things that managers can do in that country? And the responses are very different. The tools are different. The responses are different. I'm no Tim Fulbright, of course, but I would speculate that the return time on managing the habitat, there's a much longer or wider window in the Southeast because rainfall is fairly reliable, except for right now. Within 1 or 2 years, you are guaranteed a vegetative response. Do you ever have people undertake habitat management activities and then you've got a 3-year drought and they've holding their hands up and saying, "Professor, what's going on here? There's no response."
Absolutely. So we've seen those kind of scenarios play out all the time. And, one of the things that we always talk about in the Southeast is that first growing season following a fire, the improved forage availability, the more palatable forage, and you're replacing a lot of hardened off woody vegetation with succulent new growth. And that's very predictable because rainfall is predictable. Here in South Texas, if you burn and it doesn't rain, you don't get that response. And it could be a whole year before you get that response or sometimes more. And so people do undertake habitat management all the time, and it's still an essential part of any deer management program here in South Texas, but the responses are much more unpredictable based on weather patterns.
I can concur with that because it's kind of like Donnie's saying. I always tell people, if you get rain after fire, you look like some kind of fire god or goddess, as the case may be. And if it doesn't rain after you burn, they're cussing you, they're wanting their money back, the whole thing. And you just have to go, be patient, be patient. The rain will come and you will get the benefit, but you got to be really patient sometimes in South Texas. So I'm glad you brought up fire, Mike, because I want to ask you about more specifically about fire. I learned about fire in the piney woods, and of course, just how important it is for deer in like the East Texas piney woods and throughout the South, the coastal plain. And having come here, I want to ask you, it might be hard, but in this same vein of comparing and contrasting, is fire as important in the brush country for deer management as it is, say, in the coastal plain and in the piney woods?
I think it can be. I think it can be. I think it's just a lot more unpredictable in the responses, so people rely upon it less.
Okay.
And you have circumstances here in brush country where you can lose your brush if you burn at the wrong time, and then you lose your cover, and brush diversity is incredibly important. And of course, there's variation in how susceptible to being top killed different brush species are from fire. And so it's trickier. It's a lot more readily deployed in the piney woods where what's going to happen, and 9 years out of 10 you get the right rain and that sort of thing. So I think it should be, I think it can be, but I don't think it is necessarily always as readily utilized down here as it could be.
Okay.
It's just so tricky. We need that fire goddess to come in and be able to put the right fire on the landscape and get the rain.
Right. Well, there's a lot of research that shows that where rainfall is more predictable, the outcome of fire, the result of fire is going to be more predictable. And yeah, it's a hard sell when you can't predict the rain, so you can't always predict the outcome, the immediate outcome. Like I say, if you can wait, you will get that out. You will get that benefit, but it might not be this year or even next year if we're in a long-term drought. Well, I just lost my train of thought. We may actually have to cut.
I've got a question for you,
Go
Sandra.
for it.
What's the typical spatial scale of fire? So Southeastern context is always a stand. How big is a stand? 50 acres up to 500. What's the typical scenario for the rangelands there?
It really varies, but we are kind of lucky, I guess, in that a lot of our landowners have larger areas of land, just have larger ownerships than, say, a small NIPF, land in, a privately owned forest in the Southeast. So they might, if they own 10,000 acres, they might be able to burn 2,000 acres a year without it, being a big deal. And that might really bring them some benefit. So again, it does depend on the landowner, but I always say that we should just burn as big a piece as we can, because it almost takes me as much planning and as much effort and as much energy to burn 40 acres as it does to burn 1,000 acres. So let's burn 1,000 acres. If you got 1,000 acres that you can spare and that you can manage and burn this year, let's do it. Let's not waste our time on 40 acres, So that would be my advice to people who have large land holdings and are able to do that. I just remember what I was going to say a while ago was you brought up the brush and the response of brush. One of the really tricky things in South Texas is that the brush doesn't burn under prescribed fire conditions. So a lot of times folks will call me and they'll say, come on out. I've got a place I want you to look at. We want to burn it, whatever, and I'm looking at it, and we really need grass in South Texas. Grass is the fuel. That is the fine fuel that's going to carry your fire. And so where you've got brush encroachment that's sort of filled in and we don't have a lot of grass there, your fire is just going to break apart and it's just going to piddle around in there. And, I always tell people, I warn them, I'm like, you're not going to be happy. You're not going to be happy with the result, because it's going to, just like I said, it's just going to piddle around in there. It's going to break apart. We're going to have to keep lighting. And honest to goodness, a lot of folks just don't believe me until they see me try it. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, we thought that whole thing would burn under wildfire conditions. Oh yeah, those trees, all that brush is fuel under wildfire conditions. But once we've had brush encroachment that's super thick, we can't even use prescribed fire, to manage. And that's really frustrating for landowners. And it's also frustrating for me too, because honest to goodness, sometimes they just don't believe it.
Right.
Yeah, and those two things, the scale of fire and that mixed severity, that heterogeneity and severity, are both really important aspects when you think about deer management, because deer have relatively small home ranges, and you don't want the entire place to look the same. And so they want to have some intact cover, maybe some variation in time since fire. And so having a fire that burns through and just, fingers go through and burn the grass where you'll have new herbaceous vegetation coming in the next year, but there's still untouched brush for thermal cover and concealment cover, that could be really good for deer. Of course, every fire manager wants to see that nice, black carpet across the landscape, but that heterogeneity is really important. And one thing I think the Southeast has over our rangelands in terms of fire is that they do often burn in these 50-acre patches and these 200-acre patches, these stand level fires. And that small scale fire is really beneficial for a deer's home range, because it's just one portion of it. So they may still have really good fawn hiding cover in the next stand that's, thick and rank and brushy, but then they have this really nice area to go and feed in that recently burned patch. And so having either mixed severity or just heterogeneity in the time since fire on the landscape based on the small patch sizes of burns that you see in the Southeast piney woods are both really important for deer management.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, because for deer, anyway, you're right. As a burn manager, I want to drive away and leave a black square on the ground or whatever shape your pasture was. But because, and I'll tell you why, it's not because I just want to burn up the whole world. It's easier for me that way. I don't have to babysit. If everything was burned, my job here is done, and I'm going to check on it tomorrow, but I don't have to babysit for a few weeks. Okay. So that makes my life easier. But you're right. There's this sweet spot where, you have to have some brush or some woody mott's or something like that. And some people are really good at this. One of our board directors, good friend of mine, Gus Canales. Gus is so good at this. He calls it a dirty burn. And he burns enough that he grows a lot of good grass in between his brush, but he also leaves a lot of brush then for his deer. And so there's this sweet spot where you've got enough brush that the deer have browse and that they have cover. But once it's like I'm talking about once it's just encroached and it's all closed in, I can't do anything for you with fire at that point. You got to do something else first.
So how do you reintroduce fire into those systems? Do you, in the Southeast, a lot of times when you have a system like that where it's so overgrown, you go in the moist condition, do like a few skimming burns to get it back under control, but you need really hot fire to get in there. So how do you reintroduce fire once you've got those kind of situations?
What you really have to do is you have to do something mechanical first, or maybe chemical, but mechanical is the best way to get at it. Go in and, chain or root plow or aerate, roller chop something, some areas, and maybe follow up in those areas with some chemical, to keep that brush from coming back. And then as soon as you've got your grass growth in there where you can carry a fire, then burn those areas and do leave yourself that brush so that you have that cover and browse for your deer. But yeah, you got to do something drastic first, unfortunately.
It's really interesting hearing you. I was going to ask that same question. I was assuming, and I think what's fascinating here is the ecology of this. We have a different plant community, but the ecology is similar. So, like in the Southeast, Mike, it would be akin to having a closed canopy pine stand. And just because of needle accumulation, you could get a fire through there, but you're going to be very disappointed with the response because what is limited in that context is sunlight. And so you've got to go in mechanically with a thinning and get some of those trees out, get sunlight penetrating the stand. Now, when you add fire to that system, you're getting exactly what you want in terms of the return of the vegetative community. So they're very different, but they're very similar in that it's going to require a mechanical intervention there to get rid of some of the brush, or in our case, some of the canopy trees to get sunlight back in the system.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And sometimes landowners have to come at it, a little chunk at a time because that's really expensive. So once you've done that mechanical treatment in an area, then now you use fire and you keep maintaining that part with fire. And when you've got the resources, then, treat with mechanics, treat with roller chopping or whatever, another area, and then keep maintaining it with fire. Because like I say, there's just a sweet spot where, there's not enough grass or there's not enough brush, and you want something in between, I suppose.
Absolutely. A third example of that's really interested me over the years is this interaction between other disturbance regimes in South Florida. Flooding and fire interact in some really interesting ways. And so thinking about needing to go in with mechanical treatments before you can burn, this scenario really stuck out to me when I started working in South Florida. So they've changed the hydrology there such that this sheet flow, the seasonal flooding doesn't happen like it used to happen. And so some species like cabbage palm, native species, have become invasive and just erupted underneath their pine savannas. And so you have a thick mid-story of cabbage palm that if you go in and light that stand, the cabbage palm will basically burn so hot, you'll lose your pines, you'll lose your fine fuel inputs from the needle load, and you basically end up with a palm forest, which is not anybody's management objective. So they have to go in and do all this mechanical removal and clean up the cabbage palm first, and then get it to burn again like a pine savanna should.
Yeah, that's neat. That's interesting. I love the ecology of this that we're talking about. It's just so cool how it all fits together.
How does you, Sandra, you keep mentioning grass, and I totally get that from a fuel perspective. Of course, on the deer side in the Southeast, we really don't care about grass that much, and it's a constant here. We're always going to have it and get it. Yeah. But I do think about grass for the country y'all are in relative to livestock, and I was wondering what are the compatibilities of fire and your objectives for deer and then for livestock? Is there a trade-off there? Do they synergize together, or how do you handle that?
I want to hear from Mike on that too, but I think I think that they can go really well together. We've had this history in South Texas of overgrazing. And if you in the past, if you overgraze, you don't have any grass, so you don't have any fire. And then you get a bunch of brush encroachment and whatever. But if you're grazing at moderate, stocking rate, at a healthy stocking rate, light to moderate, I think that you can use fire. You can have your deer, you can have your cake and eat it too, really. We've got a project down on the East Foundation. East Foundation is really good at this, and they figured out how to do this. And on one of their probably their southernmost property down at El Sal's near Port Mansfield, Texas. We've got a big burning project where we've got they range from 500 to 1,200 acre plots, and there are some control plots. And it's a patch burning project, so there aren't fences anywhere, and the cattle just come and go as they please. And so we burn. The cattle will hit that really hard, and they'll, they'll be in there when the grass is only, an inch or two tall, and they'll give it a second disturbance that also helps keep it young and lush as it grows. And they've got woody mottes, and our prescribed fire goes right around those woody mottes. And so I think that's probably important for the deer. And then also the fire brings back forbs. The cows really aren't interested so much in the forbs when they've got good grass. And so now we've got forbs for the deer. But what do you think about that, Mike?
Yeah, you really hit on what I was thinking about there at the end is good grass management with fire and grazing is going to create the forbs that deer really require. And so I think you absolutely can have all of that. And cattle can work synergistically with deer to create that, or with fire, I should say, to create that secondary disturbance following the fire, and literally reduce some of the competition for forbs by the grass. And so certainly it can help release forbs in a sense. But I think they're compatible land uses. The problem is finding that sweet spot that varies by ranch and by year and by everything else to try to maintain stocking densities that are just right, because it's a really thin line you're trying to balance there. Because at some point the cattle aren't as interested in the forbs if there's plenty of good grass, but they'll eat it too, and they will browse, and there is really a lot of potential for competition, which is some of the work that we're doing with the East Foundation and in the deer program, is trying to understand where are those levels and how much does cattle stocking rate influence deer population performance.
That's neat. I think it's really one thing that you mentioned is just so important. Every piece of land is different. Every landowner has his or her own unique challenges, his or her own unique property and climate. And so it's really hard to make a prescription. Like, people will ask, how often should I burn it? Mm-hmm. And that's like one of the most common questions. And they hate to hear it depends, but it does.
Oh, yeah.
On a whole lot of things, But yeah, that's really so you're working on cattle competition and deer. Mm-hmm. Are you? What have you found so far?
Yeah, so we are trying to understand how cattle and deer compete and what are the outcomes of competition. And so there's an experiment that's ongoing in the northern portion of the San Antonio Viejo Ranch, where they have experimentally stocked cattle at different rotations and different densities. And so we've got deer with GPS collars that were spread across these 10 pastures that got these different treatments. And we investigated the behavioral response of that stocking event. So these were pastures that had been vacated for a few years, and there were no cattle out there. And then the deer were out there, and we basically were able to monitor the change in their niche space, more or less. So how did their behavior change? How did their resource selection change? And what we expect to be able to disentangle is there's really two forms of competition that could be influencing the deer herd. One is exploitative competition, where cattle eat resources that deer would have otherwise had. And the other is interference competition, where there's antagonistic interactions between deer and cattle. So for example, like cattle are congregating around a water source that deer no longer have access to. And so it's through these antagonistic interactions. So we looked at their behavior immediately following this stocking event where the cattle didn't have time at these relatively low stocking densities to influence forage availability in a meaningful way. And we measured that with a few different techniques. But we did see immediately this response in behavior. So they shifted their habitat selection and they started to move differently across the landscape. And so that was really a very short study where we looked at the immediate response following the stocking event. But then we scaled out and we have several years of data where we do these annual captures every year where we catch around 500 deer a year across 4 or 5 of their properties.
That's so impressive what you guys do.
It's amazing. We're actually right in the midst of it right now. And so the whole team is extremely exhausted
Tired
and worn out and just neck deep in good data. But we've been monitoring these deer populations and we collect a lot of measurements like lactation rate and antler size and body mass. And we measure rump fat deposition with an ultrasound. And so we get all these different measures of nutritional condition and population performance. And we link those back to soil, sandiness of the soil, rainfall patterns, amount of brush on the landscape, and then stocking rates. And so we're just now starting to uncover some of the effects of stocking rates on their population indices.
Cool. So you mentioned, I have a dumb question for you. That's kind of my thing. I ask the dumb questions. You mentioned lactation rate. How do you measure lactation rate? Is that just lactating or not lactating?
It is. So that's a really coarse measurement of reproductive activity in deer.
Okay.
It's not related to litter size. It's not related to fawn survival ultimately, but it gives us some sense of reproductive activity in adult deer and some early weaning. So they at least had fawns long enough that we can still see lactation when we're handling those animals in October.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
It's pretty insensitive. So when lactation rates are normal, things are probably okay. But when lactation rates are really, really low, you have a problem.
Really?
Yeah. But yeah, the whole litter size, yeah, the doe have 1 fawn or 2 fawns. So you can have a big swing and variation in recruitment with little change in the lactation index. But it's so popular because hunters can collect that data.
Oh, okay.
And so that's kind of why it's entrenched at the skinning shed, is that hunters can see it and mark it down, and we have a pretty good index. Yeah.
And one of the places I see the most value with it is looking at your early age classes. So if you're looking at yearling lactation rates, that means that animal is able to breed as a fawn, which is indicating of really good habitat quality. And so that metric can move around a little bit more than you would see at like your 5-year-old does. So it has a lot of utility, but it's really coarse and you need to catch like 500 deer a year or harvest a lot of deer to try to get that index to really reveal anything about the system.
Okay.
What do you typically see, Mike, for that yearling doe lactation rate? What is common?
Zero. Yeah, down here, very, very rarely do we see it. And so, when I worked at the Jones Center, which is, in Southwest Georgia, exceptional country. It's got 10 to 15% of the landscape in food plots and 50% of it's burned every year on a 2-year cycle. Just really perfect deer country. And they have, 40% in their yearling lactation rate. So, and that's really, really good. That means a good number of their fawns are actually breeding at their first year. Oftentimes they're breeding late, so they don't ovulate with the main rut, but they'll ovulate in subsequent ruts.
Interesting. So following along this ovulation and lactation line, I think some of your work has been on fawn recruitment, maximizing fawn recruitment. Can we compare and contrast fawn recruitment and how we maximize it in the South Texas brush country as opposed to the piney woods?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things to think about that are the same no matter where you are.
Okay.
And so really the easiest thing to manipulate to affect how many fawns are going to recruit into the population is how many does do you have on the landscape? And so doe harvest is the number one thing. It's the easiest thing to manipulate. And it's the biggest driver ultimately is how many does do you have in the population who are reproductively active this year? That's where you should always start. Harvest is the easiest place. Then you start thinking about, okay, given the fawns that we produced this year, how do we maximize their survival? And there people usually think about things like predator control or habitat manipulations. I think creating adequate fawning cover in close proximity to good feeding grounds for the does is the real secret solution. I think that's really what drives everything, is trying to make it easy for does. So, really healthy individuals, they don't take nearly as many risks. They're much more successful moms, and those are the ones that are going to provide you your fawn crop. And so, maintaining high levels of nutrition for your females throughout all of gestation. So through the winter and going into the fawning season, and then during that first month of lactation, which is really the peak energetic investment across mammals, but particularly for deer, maintaining adequate nutrition there so they don't have to make these risky decisions to try to meet their energetic needs. That's the key to it. So habitat management that maximizes a doe's nutritional state and provides the fawn adequate fawning cover would be the recommendations, whether you're in South Texas or in the Southeastern United States. Here in South Texas, that gets really complicated because we often have droughts, and we often have just a lack of forage available for deer, for does, because of a drought. And so that's where people start to think about things like supplemental feed, so that those females have the energy that they need, the dietary requirements that they need during that final trimester, where like 80% of the fawn's development is occurring, and that early life lactation period, where really predation risk is at the peak, energetic demands are at the peak. Maintaining doe's nutritional condition at that time is incredibly important. And so the techniques to doing that are different in different places. Like here, we rely more on growing our plants somewhere else, pelletizing them, and bringing them to South Texas, where in Bronson's country, they just grow the plants right there in the forest that they're trying to manage.
Okay.
So, but the mechanisms are the same. It's just the tools are slightly different.
I got you. Okay. So instead of a food plot, it's supplemental feed.
It's supplemental feed.
Interesting.
Yep. And then when you think about food plots, a lot of people have interest in food plots that are based on providing harvest opportunities, growing something that's going to be available late in the year. And that's really that's not beneficial to maximizing your fawn crop.
It's not.
You want to have something in the early growing season and throughout the summer, and maintaining that 2-season food plot would be really important. Maintaining your harvest plots is very important too, for a whole other host of reasons, but these nutrition plots in the summer is absolutely the key. And there are people, down in the valley who are utilizing food plots in that capacity as well. And in sort of the eastern edges of South Texas, you see more of that.
Okay. So this 2-season food plot, is that something you have to plant twice, or is there a plant you can use that will get you through those 2 seasons?
No, it's typically two different crops.
Okay.
Yeah. So you'll have something that's nutrition based through the antler cycle and the fawning season in the summertime. And then you'll have something like a green patch of wheat, oats, rye, something like that allows you to maximize your harvest opportunity in the winter.
Okay. That makes sense.
So that was a good question, Mike. I wanted to follow up on that. Is what do you see as on the properties you visit? You obviously are on some properties that are very, very successful with trophy buck production. What do you see as the biggest mistakes? So if like you could reach the most people with, here's number 1, number 2, number 3, what's kind of your advice for what are some things that they can do that they would see a benefit from?
Wow, that's a great question, Bronson. I've thought a lot about that, and I've gone to a lot of these premier deer ranches in the last few years, and you ride around and you talk to their managers, and then they ask you what we should be doing, and it's you guys are already pretty well got this figured out. So a lot of times I don't have a lot to offer. It's more really about optimization of their program. So what can they stop doing that may not really be that big of a benefit, and what should they maybe increase a little bit, but there's still we have a lot of questions about the timing of resources and how important that is. So a lot of people will supplementally feed throughout the year. And then like I was just talking about during the summer, it's really important maintaining your antler development, maintaining your fawn development, but then they'll switch to corn in the fall. And that's really just a function of trying to maximize your harvestability. And that's really effective for that. But I have a lot of questions about the timing of resources and how important it is. And so from the livestock world, we know that the condition of a female at ovulation is incredibly important to the offspring's outcome. And so we take away this more balanced food that we give them throughout the year and replace it with a high energy food, which is probably what's lacking most in our environment down here is energy. And so they get that from the corn, but we've removed a lot of the protein. And so their condition at ovulation is not maximized necessarily. So we pull the rug out from under them and switch them over. And so while we don't have a lot of data on this from the deer world, I do wonder how timing of resources influences that outcome for offspring. And if we're getting all that we could, and if we really want to maximize the quality of our mature bucks for harvest potential later, maximizing doe condition at ovulation, at maximizing the fawns that are coming into their first winter. There's so much information from the livestock world about fetal programming and the importance of those first few weeks of gestation. And we just don't have that information in the deer world. It's things that we're chasing in our research program now. But that's one thing that I think about a lot is just the timing of resources. When do the bucks need it for antler growth? When do the fawns need it to maximize their growth patterns? And when do the does need it to be in the best possible condition at ovulation?
Yeah, we've had a perfect world with unlimited money and time and all that. We would love to replicate this and run the studies a lot longer, but we found a lot of evidence for what you're describing, Mike, with that fetal programming or an epigenetic effect. And the thing that I thought was most interesting is that it's an intergenerational relationship. Mm-hmm. And it's not what you eat. What you eat is important, but you're also influenced by what your mother ate and what her mother ate. And so that's those stress and hormonal cues that are passed to that developing fetus. And at least what we think is that is affecting the expression. So you're not changing the genes, of course, but you're affecting what genes are expressed. And that's all accomplished with nutrition and the timing of nutrition, as you expressed. And I often, Mike, you'll hear people say that, what supplemental feed did for the deer herd. Mm-hmm. And I try to always not correct, but change the conversation. It's not what supplemental feed did, it's what nutrition mm-hmm. did. And you offered it in the form of supplemental feed, but you could accomplish that same effect with a whole bunch of different forms of nutrition. It could be through habitat management. It could be through agriculture and food plots, and in some circumstances, supplemental feed, but it's all nutrition.
Absolutely. That's something that we've been thinking a lot about too, following up on some of your work and trying to understand how DMPs produce the way that they do. And so for folks across the country who don't know about this DMP program in Texas, it's legal to put 15 or 20 does in a 5-acre pen with a desirable sire and allow them to pull or to breed all of those females, and then you release them the subsequent year. And we do see responses. They're certainly growing large deer through this program. And we have the question, how much of this is genetics? Obviously we're selecting sires, but we have no control over selecting the females, at least in that first generation. And how much of it is this condition where you're putting them on an ad libitum diet in a small environment with no predators and limiting their energetic expenditures. So we're trying to figure out how much of that is the actual genetics versus this environmental cues, the epigenetics, if you will, from those processes, and trying to understand which is, well, really what they're both contributing. How much are they both contributing?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I never thought about the fact that in that DMP pen, there's no predators and they're being fed every day and they don't have to expend much energy. So that would be cool if you guys could figure that out.
We're working hard at it.
You can grow big deer in deer pens when those bucks don't have to worry about anything else.
That's true.
They even have a veterinarian at disposal if they get sick. So it's a lot different when you're out there in the brush country or the piney woods and you have to fend for yourself.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it amazes me that these epigenetics are multi-generational. And we've heard this before. We interviewed a shark guy who had found the same thing. But so for folks I guess folks need to understand that their investment, they might not see the payoff of their investment this year or even next year, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so it could take some time to change that programming. And so what epigenetics really seeks to do is match the phenotype, the phenotypic expression, the trait, the variation in traits to the environment. And so it's trying to match that. And it takes a while to change that. And so uh, some of these traits that are not optimal for our desires are they may be optimal for survival. In other words, it may not always be good to be big with large antlers. That's what we want, but that may not be what the environment is calling for. And so, if you are from an environment that has demonstrated that you have higher reproductive output or survival with a different body design, it can take a generation or two to see that response where it says, okay, this is a more consistent environment. I can invest in these secondary luxury traits, these antlers. And that can allow that can require, I should say, a couple of generations to actually see that effect.
Interesting.
Ecology's interesting.
I know, right?
Evolution's interesting.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just why you can't fix these problems. And Mike's familiar with the Southeast, and generations before us were, we'll just populate these areas with Wisconsin deer or Minnesota deer, and lo and behold, after a generation, you don't have Wisconsin deer in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi because they have to their phenotype has to match the environment that they're in. So now they have to deal with this pesky EHD. So a lot of them die from that. And then you look at it's probably from a heat dissipation standpoint, Mike, not advantageous to be in South Florida and weigh 300 pounds. Mm-hmm. That, there's some serious physics and ecology going on there. And that's why we see this regional variation so much is the context, the environmental context that deer has to live in. And, food is one of those, but also heat conservation and dissipation could be another one.
Okay. So dumb question again. EHD, this is heat dissipation. What's the E?
Hemorrhagic disease, blue tongue or epizootic hemorrhagic disease. It's very, very common in Texas and the Southeast.
Oh, okay.
Not so common up north.
Okay.
Yeah. But when deer up north are confronted with that virus, they don't have the antibodies or anything. And so you'll see a much larger die-off. So you might have 50% of your deer die in Illinois, and that same virus may kill less than 5% in Mississippi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bronson, one thing that we're doing in our DMP studies that's probably of interest is, we understand that they do grow larger antlers, and that's by design. We're selecting sires based on that, but we're trying to understand the trade-offs there. And so, thinking about the mismatch in your environment, all that fetal programming taking place in a 5-acre pen, what does that mean for your survival when you are released into the wild? Are you going to have as high of a survival probability as a pasture-born fawn? And we know from soft release reintroduction programs that typically pen-raised quail don't have the same survival as wild birds. And so we're trying to ask that question: are there trade-offs for growing these larger antlered individuals? Do they have the same survival probability because they have been programmed for a totally different environment that they're ultimately going to grow up in?
That will be some fascinating results. Mm-hmm. That'll be very, very interesting. And Mike, I remember years ago, Stuart Stedman, who you know quite well, he just studied on the Faith Ranch. He wrote a document, and I don't remember the title, but it was like My Rules for Supplemental Feeding, or What to Expect When You Start a Supplemental Feeding Program. And something that really stuck with me, because I think it's the culmination of all the things we're talking about, is the constant good nutrition and time, an epigenetic response. But I know he mentioned that you need to give it a decade. Mm-hmm. That 2 generations in a decade is really what it takes. And not so much in Texas, but in the Southeast, I think people don't understand the investment and the long-term investment that's required with this type of program, because what you literally have to do is you have to have a significant change in diet quality for the population of deer that you're managing.
Mhm.
And it's not just a feeder or two here and there. You're raising the diet quality of the entire population. And then the response time may be a decade before you see it. But we spoke, Mike, with Harry Jacobson on the podcast a month or so ago. And it was really interesting because he was recounting all of these experiences where people did that and waited a decade, and he was just like, it really does work, but it really does take a long time. And so I try to just to always remind our listeners not to have any misgivings of this is not a band-aid or an instant response. It's going to take a long time, but it does work.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really the key is nutrition and epigenetics. And people are really quick to go to how do we improve our genetics of our herd? And can we bring in deer with better genetics, or can we cull our way to better genetics? And I think you're a lot better off thinking about nutrition and epigenetic triggers than you are manipulating genetics through harvest.
Could not agree more. And I think the Comanche Ranch study is going to show that. There will be the proof right there.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting. I just keep saying that. That's really interesting.
Well, Mike, here's something I say quite often, and please feel free to disagree with me because I'm a lifelong learner and I'm always open to being educated. I have always said to people in the Southeast that they watch a hunting program, reading a hunting magazine, and of course you're going to have a lot of really big deer from South Texas, and people always typically gravitate towards, man, those genetics in Texas. It's just amazing, those genetics in South Texas. And my response, and some people will nod their head and some people just don't believe what I'm saying, is that there's nothing special about the genetics in South Texas. It is the way the land is managed, and really, really large land holdings allow the buck age structure to get to an extent to where you are only harvesting the right-hand side of the bell-shaped curve, that 5%, 3%, 1%. These are very, very rare bucks that even in South Texas standards are being produced, but they're allowed to get to 6, 7, or 8 years of age and they're harvested. If you go back and look at the average mature South Texas buck and the average Georgia or Mississippi buck, they're pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. It's just that you can manage for and harvest the outliers in South Texas. Now, do you agree with that?
I would love a spirited debate with you, Bronson, but I think you're spot on. I think that's exactly right. And I think the evidence is in not only the averages that you mentioned, but South Texas deer have been used to restock a lot of the southeastern United States. And they do not look like South Texas bucks after a few generations. And so I absolutely agree. It's age structure and it's the scale of the landscape. It's just allowing more of the animals to meet their genetic potential. And that's absolutely why so many great bucks come out of South Texas.
Yeah.
I love this message, you guys. So could we say, to a landowner who can't afford a $50,000 buck that, he or she can really manage well with fire, with grazing, with these other tools at their, at their, ready, that they could, in a decade or so, like Stuart says, get there without that $50,000 buck or something? I mean, is that what we're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would add, Sandra, with sufficient time.
Okay.
And so one way I like to, we've all had stats classes, so normal distribution and bell curve, all that makes sense to us. But another way to look at it from a management perspective is to get one of those 5%er bucks, which wherever you're at, they may be 170 inches or 180 inches. That means you need to produce, 100 mature bucks. And of those 100 mature bucks, 2 or 3 of them are going to be these big giants.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just have to think about your context, your deer population, the number of does you have, as Mike said earlier, how many buck fawns are you producing, and you can kind of get more of a spreadsheet approach to it if you have enough time. So good things will happen, good nutrition, age structure, and a number of generations for the number of buck fawns and the number of generations you have to allow the stats to work in your favor.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's still going to take a lot of input of money, of course, and energy. Maybe
Absolutely.
you can spread it out more over time than just this one really big investment.
Absolutely. And I think that's definitely the way to go. It would be thinking about spreading it out over time. And Bronson's spot on. If you're thinking about shooting one of those top 1 or 2% bucks, that's why a lot of people carry so many deer in their properties here is they want to, instead of that scenario being 100, make it 300. And now I've got 6 of these bucks I can shoot this year. And that affects you in terms of your feed bill and things like that. But it absolutely is the driver, is making sure that you have the time and the conditions right. And part of it is it's not just the conditions of this year. And so antlers are a really true reflection of nutritional condition for this growing cycle and how they came out of winter last year, but it's also affected by that early life condition, that programming we were talking about. And so when you can have a buck that is 7 years old and it's a wet year, and 7 years ago was also a wet year, that's going to maximize their potential. And so really it takes time. It takes time, and you want to try to link up and allow those fawns that are coming out of that really nice cohort to reach maturity.
Yeah. Allow your investment to mature.
Yeah. Like you would any investment.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you guys, I know there are young people who are listening to the two of you talk about your careers in deer who would just give their left hand probably to have your career. Do you have advice for young folks who would like to have a career like yours?
Sure. Yeah. I think about how I got to this position, and I'm really fortunate. I had really great mentors that showed me along, and my advisors in graduate school were Bob Warren and Mike Connor. Bob was a professor at UGA, the University of Georgia, and Mike Connor's a scientist at the Jones Center. And they gave me a ton of good advice. And one of the pieces of advice that they gave me, and this isn't specific to the deer world, was, going after a PhD, trying to become a research scientist it's hard no matter what you do, but chase something that you're really curious and passionate about. So then when you're really plugging away in those late hours and working hard at it, it's not as bad. It's not as hard. You're still motivated by the work. And so really following your passion is important, I think. I had one other piece of advice that came from a colleague that not nearly as close as my advisors, but a guy named Joel Brown, who's an evolutionary ecologist. And, we had him down at the Jones Center and we were doing some field work together. And he told me, he said, science is a social phenomenon among humankind. And I thought a lot about that. And this is an interesting thing to think about, because we're always obsessed with the bell-shaped curve and the numbers and the right study design and controls. But a lot of it is the social side of it, the networking, building the teams that you're excited to get on the conference call with, avoiding the people who you dread getting on the conference call with. And so really thinking about the social side of it is really important. Be a good colleague, come through on time, do your part, be a good friend in the way that you work, help elevate people. And so I thought a lot about that piece of advice, which was really just an offhand comment as we were walking through the longleaf pine one day, but it really stuck with me. And I think it's something I've said to a lot of people is nurture your network and be a good colleague. And I think it'll pay dividends.
Oh, I love that. I mean,
I do too.
We hear a lot about networking, of course, that's good advice, but being a good colleague, I don't hear a lot of people say that, and it is so important. So important. What about you, Bronson?
Well, that I think what Mike said is perfect, and I completely agree. And Bob Warren, when I was an undergraduate, gosh, hard to think of anyone better than Bob Warren in terms of giving advice and being a mentor. He was such a professional. Well, one thing I remember that helped me, I mean, it literally changed the trajectory of my life and my career was my advisor was Larry Marshington. And he twisted my arm to get out of my comfort zone and go work on this internship on the Faith Ranch in South Texas. And, at that point in my life, I thought I was always going to be in the Southeast. And, I guess I am to some degree. Um, but that was so important for me because I started building, Mike, that network of people. And then I got out of my comfort zone, went and worked on a ranch, and I met this fellow named Charlie DeYoung. And later in life, a project came open at Texas A&M Kingsville, and so I was able to become a student of Charlie DeYoung. And I look back on those days of how such a different system ecologically of what I was used to. And it just, changed the way I think and understood deer management. And then I still have colleagues today that I still work with because of that network, Mike, at A&M Kingsville. And so I couldn't agree more. I guess I'm just agreeing with Mike and that those things are important. Go after something you love to do. If you love doing it, it's not so much work. And then surround yourself by people that are your friends and you trust, and they're going to build you up and complement you. And that's kind of the keys to a good career.
Yeah. Great advice. Great advice for both. I love the advice too. Get out of your comfort zone, and not just like emotionally and mentally your comfort zone, but go new places, even if it is just temporary. I think
Right.
For me personally, I learned fire in the piney woods, and then I went up to the high plains, and now I'm down here in South Texas, and it's a very different animal at all three places. And I am so grateful for those experiences that I have, because I know it makes me a better fire manager and a better fire ecologist, and I just understand fire better because of being able to work in those different ecosystems. So I think that's great advice. And even you don't have to stay somewhere forever, but go someplace new and learn what you can learn there.
I had an aha moment that's related to fire and deer and going to new systems. And
Yeah.
so I was trained in fire ecology and deer ecology in the longleaf pine systems in the upper coastal plain of Georgia. And everything was about small patch size mosaic burns and making sure a deer in their home range has 2 or 3 different ages, time since fire that they can pick from.
Sure.
And maintaining that diversity. Everything's about diversity. Never let the table go empty, so to speak, for a deer's food. And I moved to Virginia and I started working there, and I was working with the Forest Service, and they were putting these enormous burns in the landscape. And I was just like, you can't burn 5,000 acres side of a mountain. This isn't going to be any good for deer. They're not going to have any fawning cover for a year, and you're going to lose a cohort. And I went out and saw these burns and started walking through them, and I was like, oh, there's this whole other element that's driving this heterogeneity that creates different time since fire topography, which I had no experience with fire and topography, but you'd have aspect and topography that would totally change the way the fire behaves, such that a deer's home range still had 3 or 4 different time since fires within it. And just going to that new system changed my thinking entirely about scale of fire.
Yeah. That's a great example. Yeah. So I have a question for you. This is our favorite question. We love to ask our guests for a biology blunder. And I can imagine with, working with deer, capturing 500 at a time or whatever, things go wrong. Do you have any time when something went wrong that was kind of funny?
Well, this is a very competitive list as I reflect on the career. No shortage of blunders. There's a shortage of blunders that resulted in fun stories. But sticking with the theme of deer and fire today, I thought about one, and I was working on the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge in South Florida, trying to understand how Florida panther recovery was influencing deer population dynamics. And it was this long-term study we were doing, and we were catching deer in all kinds of ways. We caught deer with helicopters primarily, but our sample was very biased towards the open places, the big open prairies and marshes where we could use the helicopters. And so we were supplementing that capture effort with darting and rocket netting that we could tuck into smaller openings or deep in the forest. And I had a whole new crew of people come down that I was training on how to restrain deer in the rocket nets and get them untangled and process the deer. And we pick a couple people to sit in the blind and tell them, okay, when the deer get on the bait, you're going to pull this trigger, the net's going to go over the deer, and then you bust out of the blind and go jump on whatever deer is closest to the edge that you think is closest to getting out. If there's a big group of deer, hold the one that's closest. But everybody go restrain a deer, and we'll be there. We'll hear the rockets go off, and we'll be there 30 seconds later, and a truckload of people come and help. And everything goes as planned. Right before dark on Friday afternoon, the rockets go off, and I'm excited, so I can maybe go home this weekend, get these people trained, and leave the study site for once. And I go flying up in the truck, and I get to the group of people who are supposed to be laying on the deer, and they're all just running through the prairie. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Get back on the deer. And I hadn't noticed that the rockets had landed in the dry grass and started a fire that was spreading away from the deer, thankfully, but it was spreading relatively quickly considering it was 5 o'clock and the whole fire crew had left for the week and there was nobody left on the refuge to call. And this is a system that is pretty famous for wildfires.
Pretty flammable.
Yes, very flammable. And so we had a really quick dance where we're all stomping out the fire by hand. And some of us were trying to hold deer down to make sure that they were, susceptible to the fire. And ultimately everything worked out. No deer were harmed in the making of the story. And we were able to put out the fire and no one was the wiser. But that's one I thought of that was somewhat on theme for this episode.
Oh, definitely. That's a great story. I've done that dance myself. I didn't have to hold deer down at the same time though. So yeah.
I don't have one as good as Mike. In fact, Sandra, I was thinking one of my biggest blunders, and there's really no lesson here. It's that bad.
There doesn't have to be a lesson. Not at all.
Maybe the lesson is stuff is always going to happen and forgive yourself. But
absolutely.
I think back professionally, one of the biggest goofs I made was I would call it not a biology, but an outreach mistake. And I was in charge of a big outreach event, a seminar series, and typically, as you know, you'll get sponsors for those to help defray the cost of the meal and printing and all that sort of stuff. And so I'm up on stage and getting ready to kick off the seminar series. And not only did I get the name of the sponsor wrong in my mind as I'm running through of who it is, I recommended the competitor
oh my goodness.
of the people that were sponsoring. And while it's coming out of my mouth, and so you can just imagine the emotions and hormones. I'm on stage in front of 100 or so people, and I see the sponsor in the back of the room get up and walk out and slam the door. And all this is running through my head, and they're like, oh my gosh, I got that wrong. And so got the seminar going and went and apologized. And then at lunchtime, I revealed my mistake and basically just fessed up and said, I'm a human. I got it wrong. My apologies. Here's the sponsor. And I guess the good part was by the end of the day, because of everyone laughing at me, as they should, it ended up drawing more attention to the sponsor, and more people went up and talked to the sponsor afterwards about that Strickland guy. What an idiot,
Yeah,
it generated a lot of conversation. So it ended up working out okay, but that was a blunder.
Oh my God. That would be mortifying.
It was.
Mortifying.
But it all worked out. Worked out. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I'm glad they were forgiving, and I'm glad you were able to fix it, make it work for them. That's great. That is actually a pretty funny story, Bronson.
Yeah. And I was the butt of the joke. Yeah.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Mike, do you have anything else you'd like to share with us today?
I don't, Sandra.
Okay. That's fine.
I'm happy to talk about anything.
Bronson, do you have any more questions?
No more questions, just a comment. Appreciate what y'all are doing there with this podcast. And Mike, of course, enjoy your work and all the work out of the Institute down there. And just great to talk to you. Great to have this conversation. And I really enjoyed it.
This was a fun conversation, and I learned a lot about deer. And I want to say, I want to thank Bronson publicly. Bronson, when we were writing this grant to the Harvey Weil Sportsman Conservationist Award of the Corpus Christi Rotary Club, which is who funded us.
Make sure you get your sponsor right.
That's right. I got it right. I got it right. And it's kind of a mouthful. Bronson wrote a letter for us, and I also have to say, in addition to the letter, Bronson, you were an inspiration. It's like, okay, if another academic can do this, I can do this too. I can figure it out too. So we've enjoyed the Dear You podcast over the years, and it's a great podcast. And thank you for the inspiration and the letter.
Absolutely, always happy to help.
It was a big help.
Great.
Thank you so much, both of you. Hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.